class. So, this is our first topic in our first module, and we're going to be looking at a very broad concept. That's the concept of gender. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how gender has been studied in the field of industrial and organizational psychology, specifically within the context of the interface or the intersection of work and life. And I'll start by saying there's just a lot here. There's been a ton of published research over several decades. And I'm really, in this set of slides, I'm really just taking a 35,000 feet view here, skirting the surface, trying to highlight some of the patterns that have emerged over time, looking at how our understanding of the relationship between work and life and how gender impinges on it has changed over time in light of some of the research findings that we've seen. And we'll be paying closer attention to how to apply some of these findings. So, what kinds of evidence based recommendations might we make given what research has shown? So, what are we going to cover here in this set of slides? So, I'm going to take you on just a very brief history of women in the workplace, just to sort of set a foundation for where to begin the conversation about work life balance. We'll be looking at some of the issues that have more commonly been experienced by women in the workplace and how those experiences have represented disparate treatment, and we'll look at some of the causes. What are the various causes that are understood to be behind those disparities? And what kinds of incentives are there for companies to make changes? What are some of the best practices that companies have taken to address ongoing gender disparities in the workplace? And what are some of the suggestions we might make for the future, both in terms of what interventions and changes can be made in the workplace, but also what researchers should be studying. So we'll start here with a couple of graphs or figures to look at labor force participation by gender, kind of set some parameters here for where we begin this area of inquiry. So on the right side of the screen, on the right side of the slide, you see a line graph. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Which, by the way, if you're looking to nerd out on some of these concepts, some of this data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has everything, and it's available very easily accessible, and free. So this is where this data comes from. This data ends in the year 2023, so it's fairly current. But what we're really focusing on here with this line graph is the difference between men and women in this overall trend that we see in labor force participation. So you see the top line there, that red line represents men's labor force participation, and the bottom line, the blue line, represents women's labor force participation. This is from 1948 to the present, so post-World War II to the present. We see just generally that the trend seems to be a decline in labor force participation for men, and an increase, a steady increase for women, though there are some bumps along the way. If we look on the left, the table that I've prepared shows you data that compares the year 1970 with 2025. And we're looking at employment for all ages. That's anybody over the age of 16. So that would include teenagers, of course, high school students, college students, and also people who have entered pension age or retirement age as well, who still participate in the labor force, of which there are millions, of course. And then the lower row there, the bottom row, that what that says is prime ages 25 to 54. So labor economists, statisticians, people who study labor statistics tend to segment out those prime ages, because those are the ages at which most people are working. Most people who expect to or want to be working will be working in those age ranges. So between 25 and 54. So we tend to see much higher numbers if we look just at those ages. We would see lower numbers for the all ages group, because many high school students, college students don't work. They may be more focused on on their studies. They may be able to, right, have the luxury to do that. That not everybody has that luxury, of course. And same thing for older adults. There are many older adults who may no longer be participating in the workforce because they've retired. They're collecting a pension now. They um, are doing other things, but of course, that is something that not everybody can afford to do or desires to do. So, some people, of course, stay in the workforce much past those ages. So, that's what we're seeing here in terms of the two rows. And then we can see for 1970 and 2025 that we tend to see higher labor force participation for men, right on the left of each portion there. So in 1970, for all ages, we have 78% of men participating in the labor force. For the prime ages, it was 96%. So that's almost everybody, almost every man in those prime ages was in the labor force in 1970. Now, if we look at men to closer to today in 2025, we see that for all ages, it's really declined about 10%. For the prime ages, it's also declined a little bit, 6%. What would be the explanation for that? Well, it could be that there are fewer younger men maybe entering the workforce. So it could be teenage and college age men who are delaying employment. It could be that men are more likely to retire today than they were in 1970. Or it could be that some men are choosing to stay home, to participate in caretaking responsibilities, which is also a trend that we have seen. So all of those could be potential reasons we see that decline in the men's labor force participation. The bigger story here, of course, though, is the women and the greater participation in the labor force. So you see in 1970, for all ages, it was less than half, 43%. In 2025, we have over half, 57% of women participating in the labor force. And for prime ages, we also see a big jump from 1970 to 2025, from 50% up to 78%. All right, so the current situation, we see a continuing gender pay gap. And this is one of the most vexing things for um, those who study labor, those who are interested in social equality. The gender pay gap persists despite a law being passed, a federal law in the US. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. Ever since, we have continued to see um, this problem of a gender pay gap that doesn't really go away, though it has shrunk. So we see, if we this is from the Pew Research Center. You see the information here, the data. This goes up to 2024, so it's not right up to the minute current, but it's pretty close. Pew studies this on a periodic basis with their current population survey that they do. And what we see here, again, we're looking at workers of all ages, that's 16 and up, and then we're looking at workers in that prime group. In this case, they're really looking at younger prime age workers from 25 to 34. So they're not going all the way up to age 54. We see the overall gender gap is 15%, meaning that for every dollar that a man is earning, 85 cents is earned by the average woman. If we look at younger workers in those prime age years, we see that it's a 95% parity. So women in those age groups are earning about 95% of what their male contemporaries are earning. So we do see a smaller gap for younger people. We do see a narrowing gap overall. That's good, but it still is a gap and one that has to be explained. And one of the stories that I think this class will help us understand is why is the gap so much larger for workers of all ages than it is for workers who are younger in those 25 to 34 age range. And part of that has to do with the motherhood penalty, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Here, this slide just shows information from the U.S. Census Bureau, their current population survey. This is from the annual Social and Economic Supplement survey that was conducted in 2023. It's just showing you the wage gap broken down by race and ethnicity. So here we see that the largest gaps, that is the wage gap, the gender wage gap, is largest for white non-Hispanics and Asians, 20% and 19% respectively. But both groups earn more than Blacks and Hispanics overall. So you see a smaller gender pay gap, but you see lower wages overall. The gender gap is the smallest for Blacks at only 4%, but it's still there. And for Hispanics, it's a little bit larger, but smaller than for Asians and white non-Hispanics at 13%. So I think this is just kind of interesting to look at how all of this intersects, and how wages really do differ depending on who you're talking about, if you're talking about men, women, or which racial group you're talking about. And of course, there are many explanations for this, and we'll look at a few of them in a few slides. One of the things that helps us understand the gender wage gap is something called the motherhood penalty. So, of course, there are some jobs that are more, quote, mother friendly. Researchers have reported on these things. Those tend to be jobs where there is more flexibility allowed of employees. So maybe opportunities to work from home or shorter hours. But they also tend to come with a lower status and lower pay and fewer benefits. So those mother-friendly jobs can be really important for families, really important for working moms, but they also carry this sort of cost. And motherhood has also long been associated with lost work experience and losses of seniority, as women who still take on disproportionately more childcare responsibilities than their husbands or their partners, their male partners, tend to experience more of the career costs associated with taking on those responsibilities. So that's where the lost work experience comes from. And so we have this notion of a motherhood penalty, which we'll be exploring here in the course in this first module. The study that you see here on the slide is one from 2020. It was a big meta-analytic study that was published by two Polish researchers, Kukrowska, Torzuska, and Maciek. What they have done is actually quite impressive in collecting 208 studies and looking across those studies at evidence for a motherhood penalty, which they did find. They found that it was around 3.6 to 3.8% penalty, depending on which study you consult. They found that the motherhood penalty was still in place, was still robust, but that it did differ depending on where you look. So in Nordic countries, for example, in Scandinavia, they found evidence for the smallest motherhood penalty there, whereas in North America and in the rest of Europe, the evidence was stronger for a more persistent gap. So, what are the causes of the gender wage gap? Well, there are many, and the ones that have been most studied I have here represented on this slide. So, we have really four categories, or four causes of the gender wage gap. For which there's evidence. So there's the first one is there are differences in the industries or jobs worked, meaning that men and women show differences in which industries they pursue, what kind of degrees they get, and what kinds of jobs they tend to work, and that on average, men tend to choose industries and jobs where they earn more money compared to women. That's kind of what we see. The differences are small, though, and this does not completely explain the gender wage gap. It offers a partial explanation. Next, we see there are differences in hours worked as well, and this is something that they touch on in the meta-analysis I just spoke about. But we do see overall, generally, that men tend to report working more hours compared to women, and this is often attributed to women taking on more caregiving responsibilities that take them away from work. So whether that's caring for the home, doing more of the caring for the home, but certainly more things like childcare, elder care, etc. This is largely the attribution given for why we see differences in hours. Again, this differences in hours worked is something we can see substantiated in the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as in other places. But it, again, doesn't completely explain the gender wage gap, it just offers part of the explanation. Another potential explanation or piece of the explanation here is differences in years of experience. Again, this is something that is highlighted in the motherhood penalty meta-analysis from the earlier slide, as well as in some other studies. But we do see that as women take on caregiving responsibilities or take time off to have a child, take maternity leave, things like that, that this can lead to differences in the amount of experience that they have compared to their male peers, that lead to disparities in wages. And then finally, there's gender-based discrimination, which is something that's been well documented. One particularly kind of good collection of this is from Fry 2019, but there are many others that show evidence of gender-based discrimination and how this kind of discrimination can lead to loss of wages. So, zeroing in a little bit closer on discrimination, there are a number of studies that have looked at how prescriptive stereotypes for gender. So, what I mean by prescriptive, or those are kind of what the stereotypes tell us we should be. So, if you're a man, you should be, this way. If you're a woman, you should be this way. That's what I mean by prescriptive. That those kinds of stereotypes lead to some problems in the workplace and some disparities in the workplace, because for women, the prescriptive gender stereotypes are really misaligned with what it means to be, or kind of the stereotype of the best kind of employee. The best kind of employees are seen as conscientious and reliable, dependable, devoted to the company, agentic, serious, and a lot of times the stereotypes that we have built as a society and constructed as a society around women and around the female gender are inconsistent or misaligned with those workplace stereotypes. And so this has been documented in many studies. For example, looking at attractiveness, studies have shown that women pay a price for being attractive, depending on what kind of job they are seeking or occupying. So for some jobs, for example, if you're a low status employee or an entry level employee, being more attractive can confer advantages both for men and for women. But as you start to look at higher status jobs, or jobs that are seen as requiring more competence, being more attractive can actually be an impediment, but only for women. More attractive men can still do quite well and often have an advantage over less attractive men in those higher status jobs. But that's not true for women. Women are seen as quote unquote too sexy for the job, incompetent for the job. We've seen this in studies that look specifically at competence rather than just at attractiveness, or looking at competence in place of attractiveness. Susan Fisk has studied this for many years, but what the research shows is that there's kind of a double-edged sword that operates in the workplace for women, where there's this choice, this unrealistic choice that women have to make between being seen as likable, which is to be warm and likable and feminine, or being seen as unlikable, cold, calculating, and maybe competent. So the misalignment here is that to be seen as competent, you can't be seen as warm and feminine. You have to be seen as sort of cold and calculating as a woman. And so you're either good at your job and disliked, which also carries career consequences. If people don't like you, or people think that you're not a nice person, you're less likely to build social networks and social support systems in the workplace that can benefit you and benefit your career status. But that's what you have to do. You have to be seen this way in order to be effective and competent. versus being seen as likable and being seen as someone that people want to be around is also associated with this cost, this competence cost, or this competence penalty. Well, I like you, sure. I think you're really nice. I really think you're attractive. I really think you're a sweet person, but I think you're not good at your job. And that, of course, is also a problem. So there's no way to win, is the idea here. This is what the research has shown. And then motherhood status carries a special competence penalty, even beyond being a woman, where being seen as a woman, which is a subtype, well, okay, so woman is one sort of stereotype or type, right? And one lens or label through which we can socially experience each other. But a subtype in that is to be a mother. So not all women are mothers, of course, but a subtype of some of women is mothers. That particular subtype carries additional competence costs or competence penalties, unfortunately, as we see in the research, that lead to wage costs in line with what I was talking about before with the motherhood penalty. In this class, we'll be talking a lot about conflict, balance, and there are a variety of terms which I won't get into right now. But one of them, one of the earliest terms that was used in this area of research is the work-family conflict. This idea that work is interfering with the family. We're working, we're spending time at work, we're um, uh, putting our resources, our energies toward work, and this is having a consequence on our families. That's one way to look at it, and it's certainly something we'll be studying. And here in this slide, what you're seeing is that work family conflict is something that's been studied for decades now. It occurs for all employees, so it's certainly not something that only women experience, but it is something that historically women experienced more compared to men. Um, but that's changing. So today we're seeing in more recent studies in the past decade or so that there's more and more evidence that men are reporting similar levels of conflict or close to the same amount of conflict between work and family as women. So there's not a huge gender difference anymore. And if we look at parents specifically, this is when we go off the charts. So compared to non-parents, parents, particularly mothers, but also fathers to an extent, are reporting much higher conflict compared to their peers who don't have children. So work family conflict has been associated with a variety of career consequences or job consequences. It can lead to increased absenteeism. That makes sense, of course, right? Because if you have caregiving responsibilities, you have a sick child, someone has to stay home to care for the child, you have to take your child to the doctor. Or if you have an aging parent or a family member who requires care, somebody has to provide that care, and you may have to take off work to do it. So that's the increased absenteeism. If you're absent, you're doing this care, obviously you're not productive at work. So it does lead to lower productivity, and lower productivity often, but not always, but often leads to lower pay. So this is the problem of work family conflict, of course, and we'll be talking a lot about the solutions to it in the class. Another interesting concept I want to introduce here early on is something called the fatherhood premium. So we see here this image of JFK, President John F. Kennedy, back in the 1960s, with his son, his young son, underneath the desk, the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. And this idea of being a father carrying some kind of job cost is something that we haven't seen a lot of evidence for until recently, actually. A lot of the early studies showed that whereas women were experiencing a motherhood penalty, they were being seen as mothers, and whether or not they worked just as hard or harder than other women or men that they were working alongside, they paid a price, a competence price for being mothers. Whereas fathers, on the other hand, the evidence early on was that fathers received kind of a bonus, an advantage for being fathers. So one study that I cite here, Corell et al. From 2007, showed a variety of advantages for fathers, and that this is where this idea or this term, the fatherhood premium, comes from. They showed that fathers earned higher wages compared to men who were not fathers, that they were seen as more committed employees, that they were more likely to be recommended for management, almost twice as likely to be recommended for management. But at the same time, in the same study, they also showed that these men who were fathers did take more days off of work and were more likely to be late, probably because they were fathers. But even so, they still receive these benefits of being fathers. Now, interestingly, more recent research, some published by Mari in 2019 and other studies as well, have shown that this doesn't really exist. So there's some inconsistency in the published findings here, with the recent studies challenging some of the earlier work. And some of the studies recently have also suggested that the fatherhood premium may be an artifact that is explained by selection effects, so that some men who tend to be more successful in their jobs are more likely to become fathers. So it's not that fatherhood makes them successful; it's that they tended to be more successful in the first place and then became fathers, or that this is an effect that's only pertains to older men and not younger men. So we'll look more at that, of course. So, what kinds of incentives, what kinds of things can companies do? So, one thing that you see there's a lot of discourse about is flexible work arrangements. We know that shorter work hours are associated with fewer distractions and increased productivity, which is a little bit paradoxical, or it's ironic that you could have shorter work hours and actually be more productive, but that's what a number of studies have shown. There's also a lot of evidence to support longer maternity leaves, that if you offer maternity leave of 14 weeks or longer, that it can be very beneficial for moms in helping their transition back to work, in helping that they do come back to work, and that they feel less work family conflict. There are a number of studies. I pulled some statistics here from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that were published back in 2021, but there are other studies by psychologists that show that breastfeeding leads to a variety of benefits, not just for the child, of course, we know for the child, but for mom, that there are a number of physical and psychological benefits associated with it. And then finally, contrary to what seems to be the social message here, the societal message here, is that there are a number of economic benefits that have been linked to offering more flexible arrangements, and addressing work-life balance at the company level. Many companies that have done a better job of helping employees to integrate their work with their lives, the rest of their lives, actually see more more success. The companies tend to do very well. So it doesn't seem to be the case that the companies that are providing flexible work arrangements or are paying close attention to work-life balance for their employees suffer financially for doing so. And in fact, it seems to be the opposite. So, what suggestions will we make? Well, I'm going to leave that to you to come up with some ideas, and you'll see that in the discussion instructions. But for now, what I can say from just a brief kind of surface level view of some of the work that we've looked at here in this set of slides is that there is abundant evidence to suggest that flexible working arrangements are a really good idea. So if we were called in as consultants, a business calls you in and asks you, what is your advice? We could say pretty confidently that making flexible work arrangements available for more employees is a good idea. It's really not going to have financial consequences for the firm. It's really going to help recruit and retain the top talent. And it's going to make people happier and more productive at work. Offering longer parental leave. There are many studies showing that this confers advantages, not just for the individual employee who takes the leave, but also for the businesses in which they work. Giving employees more control over their work schedule, helping them to focus more on what needs to be accomplished rather than when it needs to be accomplished. And then trying harder to incorporate work and family roles and policies. So how do we align company policy with what works for people in both their work lives and their family lives, and then modeling this from the top. So we see in organizations where C-suite employees, C-suite leaders are taking parental leave, are leaving early to go to their child's basketball games, are involving their families in their work lives a bit in appropriate ways, tend to do better actually, and tend to attract more talented employees, and that tends to confer a variety of advantages, which we'll see. I won't get into the specifics here, but I think the lesson here is a really positive one, that we don't really have to choose between being a successful company and being a company that is attractive to people who have families or people who have caregiving responsibilities. So we'll see many examples of that. And then finally, looking at family-friendly policies, what are the best policies? What are the best practices? We'll get to that in the last module of the course. But this I wanted to share because it shows that we start with supervisor support, right? We start with individual managers, individual supervisors supporting individual employees. And so having a culture, kind of cultivating a culture where that support is present, that plus employees having satisfaction or feeling satisfied with the caregiving services that they have available to them. So whether that's on-site childcare or just having in their communities, in the places where they live, having access to care services, and being satisfied with the level of care that's being provided, those two things lead to less work-family conflict. So we want the supervisor support. That's something the company can certainly control. But then at a societal level, and companies can play a role here as well, but ensuring that there are services available, caregiving services available, those two things lead to lower work-family conflict, and lower work-family conflict is good for us because it leads to decreased absenteeism and higher productivity in the workplace.